Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be examining the question, what can we learn from bizarre phenomena? With me is Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a computer scientist and philosopher. He is the author of Meaning in Absurdity, What Bizarre Phenomena Can Tell Us About the Nature of Reality. His other books include Rationalist Spirituality, an exploration of the meaning of life and existence informed by logic and science. Dreamed Up Reality, diving into the mind to uncover the astonishing hidden tale of nature. Why Materialism is Baloney, how true skeptics know there is no death and fathom answers to life, the universe, and everything. Brief Peeks Beyond, critical essays on metaphysics, neuroscience, free will, skepticism, and culture. More Than Allegory on religious myth, truth and belief, and The Idea of the World, a multidisciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality. Dr. Kastrup is in the Netherlands, so this is an internet interview, and now I will switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Bernardo. It's a pleasure to be with you once again, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Jeff. It's great to be here again. It's always fun talking to you.
Thank you, and likewise. And in your book, Meaning in Absurdity, you really dig into some of the most bizarre examples that you can find, both from dreams and, interestingly, from religious experiences and from UFO sightings. There are some extremely bizarre reports from very credible witnesses. And most of the time when these things happen, I think people have a tendency to say, well, something has to be wrong. That simply can't be true. It's too strange to even go any further in my thinking process.
Yeah, and I think what is most interesting, at least what was most interesting to me when I was looking into these things, is that although the type of experience varies so much, like dreams and UFO experiences and psychedelic trances and whatnot, there are recurring themes, that are symbolic, but are consistent across types of experience. And that for me was an interesting thing, something that stimulated me to look further into this, to see if there is any root of truth or any possibility of deriving an insight from these otherwise weird and, on the face of it, dismissible experiences.
Mm-hmm. One that you wrote about that really stuck in my mind as the epitome of absurdity is a very credible witness who experienced something like a flying saucer landing in his backyard, and the occupants asked him, apparently through sign language, to get him a jug of water. And when he arrived with the water for them, he saw they were making food of some sort, like pancakes, inside of their vehicle. And when they noticed his interest, they gave him 3 pancakes that he then turned over to the U.S. government for analysis.
Yeah, that's a case reported by Jacques Vallée in one of his earlier books from the 70s. I forgot which one it was. And interestingly, there was no salt in the pancakes, according to analysis, although they were otherwise perfectly ordinary pancakes. And Vallée makes this link with the fairy lore, the stories of fairies. And apparently, the fairies don't use salt. They don't eat salt. So how this witness, so many years ago, Joe Simonton was his name, how he would come up with this story with this peculiar detail that there was also no salt in them pancakes. It's quite interesting. I mean, of course, I'm not saying in the book, and I'm not saying to you that these stories are literally true. The very point of what I'm saying is that there is more to truth than what is literally true. Mm-hmm. So the point is precisely that it isn't literally true, that there is a level of truth to it that transcends this direct, immediate level that we call literal truth. But that there is any level of truth in it is quite intriguing, because then one starts digging into the symbolic value, the metaphorical value of these stories, which are not just idiosyncratic. They clearly, this metaphorical value, this metaphorical truth, does not arise merely in the minds of a single human being. It's not a personal story. There is a collective stream underlying this that sort of unifies Joe Simonton's UFO sightings and fairy lore, for instance, or the dreams of Jung's patients, and so on and so forth. And that's what I thought was quite interesting to look into.
You seem to be approaching these phenomena from the point of view of a logician. You're suggesting that logic, even though they seem so terribly illogical, we can apply logic to them.
Yes. When we contemplate different narratives about the nature of reality, about what is true and what is not true, we tend to sort of assume, even if we are not cognizant of it, we tend to assume that the bottom layer of what's real or not real is physics. It's the laws of nature, the laws of physics. If a phenomenon complies with the laws of nature, then it has a chance of being true. The report has a chance of being true. But if it violates physics, then it cannot a priori be true. And I think there is an even deeper layer in this, in our assessment of reality, and that's logic itself, because physics and mathematics, they are both built upon a set of logical axioms, things that we consider true, because they are, or so we think, self-evidently true. They do not require proof. They do not require substantiation. They do not require explanation. They are simply true. Like if A equals B and B equals C, then it's self-evidently true that A equals C. Or it's self-evidently true that a proposition is either false or true. It cannot be both true and false, and it cannot be neither. It has to be one and only one of the two. So I just mentioned as examples two of the axioms of Aristotelian logic. The second one being the law of excluded middle. Any proposition is either true or false, not both and not neither. Mm-hmm. Now the problem, and we build the castle of our physics on top of these logical axioms. Even mathematics is built on top of these logical axioms. And we don't question them. The problem is that there's a big discussion in philosophy whether these logical axioms are empirical or not, but they are largely arbitrary. There's a case to be made that for all we know, the world as it is in itself could be essentially absurd, because there is no a priori reason why the intuitive logical axioms of a primate's mind should encompass all the degrees of freedom of nature. The way we think has evolved through pressures of natural selection and evolution. We needed to survive in a chaotic and threatening ecosystem. And our logic, also as the rest of our psyche, reflects those pressures. It has not evolved to capture the general truths of nature, right? So at the bottom of what we consider essentially real is a set of arguably arbitrary axioms, the axioms of logic, and we build a whole castle on top of that. So what the question I looked into in the book was, could it be that reality has many more degrees of freedom than are allowed by our normal Aristotelian logic? Could it be that nature obeys a logic that has less or different axioms? Or maybe that it doesn't obey logic at all, that it's essentially chaotic and arbitrary, and it is we, through the apparatus of our cognition, that impose order on it, to the point that we don't even discern how it is originally. We only see the order that we impose on it at a non-metacognitive level. And that's what started me off looking into logic, alternative formulations of logic, like intuitionistic logic, and what would be the consequences if nature, for instance, operated according to intuitionistic logic and not according to Aristotelian logic, and so on, and then matching all that to absurd experiences.
Well, you are a computer scientist by your background, and I am not. But what I have heard is that there's a whole branch of software programming based on something called fuzzy logic, which is different than Aristotelian logic.
That's true, but that's not the most interesting alternative. For me, as you saw in the book, the most interesting alternative to what is a different logic? A different logic is a logic that has a different set of axioms. Mm-hmm. And axioms are things that you just take for granted. You don't have to justify them. You don't have to prove them. It's a choice, a more or less arbitrary choice. We are guided only by intuition when we choose those. And an alternative logic would have a different set of axioms. And there is this logic called intuitionistic logic, which is a constructivist kind of logic, in which we choose less axioms. We discard, for instance, the law of excluded middle. We don't say that just because something cannot be false, that it then must be true. No, you don't know that. You only know that something is true if it can be constructed by means of an example. It's a less abstract logic. It's a more concrete logic. What is true is what can be constructed, not what can be demonstrated through abstract means. But the consequence of choosing this one less axiom is that nature suddenly gains many more degrees of freedom. There can be multiple mutually contradictory truths playing at the same time. Something can be A, but it can also be B concurrently. Something can be symbolic and metaphorical, but it can also be really, really true at the same time. And that's what I thought was fascinating, because what makes us consider many of these so-called absurd experiences dismissible is precisely this violation of the law of excluded middle. If it is this, then it cannot be that. So the experience is internally inconsistent, and therefore we can dismiss it on the face of it because it's just internally contradictory. Well, if intuitionistic logic is what applies to the world at large, beyond what we can perceive through the machinery of our cognition, beyond the order that we impose on it, if beyond all that, nature is intuitionistic in the way it operates, constructivist in a certain way, then absurd experiences now have a place. They cannot be outright dismissed. It doesn't still mean that they are true at any level, but it opens the door to the possibility of their being true at some level, be it symbolic, metaphoric, literal, whatever. There is this possibility now.
Now, so intuitionist logic, I understand, was developed in the field of mathematics, in particular, as a way of it was developed in your country, in the Netherlands.
The first person who worked on it was in the Netherlands, yes, and philosophers then sort of run with it, and they extrapolated the validity of the basic rationale behind the intuitionistic logic beyond its original field. It has been extrapolated to ontology, which is the study of what can be true in general, the nature of reality. And to me, that was the most fascinating. The most fascinating question is, when I perceive and contemplate the world, am I seeing its true richness in terms of its degrees of freedom, or am I seeing a filtered version of it with an order in it that has been imposed, between quotes, unconsciously by me as its observer, because of the very nature of my cognitive apparatus as it evolved through natural selection? I mean, there's enough evidence today to say that we didn't evolve to perceive truth. We've evolved to survive. And there's many good reasons to think that perceiving untruth is very, very conducive to survival. There is no reason for us to perceive things as they actually are. So who are we to say that certain experiences are a priori impossible? We are operating behind a filter we don't really know what the true degrees of freedom of nature are.
Well, one of the philosophical concepts that you seem to be challenging in your work is the very notion of realism itself.
Yes, realism, and that comes coupled with the so-called correspondence theory of truth. It's the idea that we can make statements about nature, but nature has its own independent states. Nature is whatever it is, regardless of what we say or about it or think of it. Nature simply is. So there are facts out there that are what they are, regardless of our opinion, our perception, our knowledge of them. And therefore, if I make a statement about nature, that statement is true if it corresponds with an objective fact of the world out there. And if it does not have this correspondence, if there is no objective fact in the world out there that the statement corresponds to accurately, then the statement is false. That's the correspondence theory of truth. The problem is that over the past, say, 3-4 decades, quantum mechanics has been giving us strong hints, maybe indications, maybe even more than indications. I'm being cautious here. If these weren't counterintuitive, I think most people would say, well, quantum mechanics has proven that realism is false. But because this is so counterintuitive, I'm trying to be cautious. There are strong indications that there are no such definite objective facts out there, independent of our perception of the world, of our observation of the world, that the world doesn't have a definite state for statements to correspond to or not. The world is a cloud of possibilities. And if that's the case, then the correspondence theory of truth is out the window. Then whether something is true or not does not depend on there being an objective fact out there, because these facts are not there anyway to begin with. And then you could say, well, then every experience is true as such, because there is nothing for them to correspond to anyway. So they are true as such. They are true as experiences. But that would seem then to completely eliminate the difference between fantasy and hallucination and reality, right? What I would propose, and I do propose in the book, is that you still have one extra criterion that does not depend on realism, does not depend on this idea that nature has objective, definite states independent of observation, and that is consensus. If I have an experience that I report to others, and others who were in the position of sharing that experience tell me, yes, your report is correct, we experienced the same thing, then that experience is true at a consensual level. And there are experiences that are not consensual, hallucinations, some types of psychedelic trances, schizophrenic visions. So they are still true as such, as experiences, but they don't fit into the consensus. So I think it's more productive to talk about truth as a concept that relies on consensus. What is true at a social level is the consensus of the society. What is true to me is my personal experience, and it does not require any consensus at all to carry value, meaning, and significance to me, because it's true to me as an experience that I've had, regardless of consensus, and so on and so forth. So we can still talk about truth and falsity, even if realism is not the case, but we also have to adjust the way we think about logic in order to accommodate and make sense of this, because Aristotelian logic, the way we use it, relies largely on this correspondence theory of truth.
The law of the excluded middle that you talked about means that, it's basic to all of experimental science, at least as I studied it in psychology and the social sciences. When you run an experiment, you formulate what's known as the null hypothesis, which is in effect the opposite of the hypothesis that you're really interested in. And if you can disprove the null hypothesis, that's taken as a confirmation of your experimental theory.
Yes, if the experiment cannot be false, if the hypothesis cannot be false, then it is perforce true, right? That's the law of excluded middle. Every statement has to be either true or false. And that relies on the correspondence theory of truth. It's true if it corresponds to an objective fact out there. It is not true if there is no such fact for it to correspond to. If you lose realism, you lose the law of excluded middle, and now what do you do? What justification do you have to adopt the law of excluded middle? So, as you mentioned, this started in mathematics, and the idea was if a mathematical statement is true, if I can construct it by means of an example. If I say that there is a prime number, there should be a prime number that complies with these and these properties, then the way to prove is to show me an example of one such prime number that complies to such properties. I cannot prove it by disproving its falsity or the null hypothesis. So if we translate that into philosophy, we cannot prove or disprove things in the abstract. Things can only be shown to be true or not in the concrete through examples, through experiences that are felt and experienced and reportable. And that's quite a revolution, because a lot of stuff today is proven through disproving its opposite, right? Disproving its potential falsity, or disproving that it's true and therefore guaranteeing that it's false. If now things can be true and false at the same time, and the only way to make a decision is to construct them, to construct their reality, now we are in a conception of reality in which what is real is not just out there waiting to be discovered, but to some extent what is real is what we construct to be real in the machinery of our cognition. You are in a view of reality in which nature is fairly acquiescent and malleable, and it acquiesces to what you impose on it. It will acquiesce if you impose lots of restrictions on it, but it will also acquiesce if you construct, if you allow your experience to arise and be constructed in a less constrained manner with the application of less logical axioms, so to say. And I suspect that this is what is behind absurd experiences. It's when people drop their filters. They drop their, for some reason, because of a chemical or because of loose belief systems, or naivete, innocence, whatever, for whatever reason, they drop the basic constraints of our society about what is allowed or not to be true. They open up, and nature responds in a way that an experience is constructed that may not be literally true in the sense of a certain consensus, but which is true in a symbolic way. Here is nature reacting to its observer with an experience that denotes, or at least connotes, something of value, something that is true at some level.
You point out in your book that we really have two different ways of thinking about truth. One of them you've already described, which is consensus. Then you define another kind of truth that we arrive at, which you call sort of the stronger version of truth than consensus, which I suppose is a logical proof. But at the same time, you point out that every logical proof, because it's necessarily based on an axiom, is also an act of faith.
Ultimately, logic is a question of faith. Yes, because it starts from axioms that you just take to be self-evidently true, but you have no good reason to think that. I mean, there's a big debate in philosophy about this. Some people say that logic is empirical, but then you get quantum mechanics, which throws logic sort of upside down. And other people who just bite the bullet and say logic is just something that's hard-coded in our primate brains for us to believe that it should be like that. Nature seems to comply to our logic, because we build our scientific theories based on our logic, and guess what? Nature seems to behave according to that. But from this idealist perspective, this idea that nature is essentially mental, this mental universe around us acquiesces to the degrees of freedom that we impose on it, or the restrictions that we impose on it, is not surprising. It's just reacting to the machinery of our cognition, to the limitations we impose on it, to what we allow ourselves to perceive and not perceive. So that's not an argument against the case I'm making. But I think the strongest argument to say that my position does not entail relativism, the notion that whatever you say, it's true for you, and it's equally true whatever everybody else says. No, that's not what I'm putting forward. I'm not putting forward this notion that whatever you say is true. No, I think there are ways for us to choose as a society what is true at a consensual level or not. There are the definitions of truth that do not rely on the principle of the law of excluded middle or the correspondence theory of truth. One we just talked about. The other one would be internal consistency. Mm-hmm. If you're building the logical structure of your worldview, which has several elements, and these elements begin to undermine each other, then you're in trouble. I mean, it could be okay, but in a sense, you're undermining your own system. But if you build it in a way that is internally consistent, that there is coherence, that the statements you make about reality cohere and support one another, then you erect a strong castle. You erect a strong scaffolding onto which to project your experiences of the world and construct your experience of the world as an individual or as a society, as a civilization, as a species even. And I think this ultimately is the strongest principle, at least for the way we tend to think, for our basic logical intuitions. This is the strongest principle. It is the principle, for instance, that underlies the notion that if you multiply two negative numbers, you get a positive one, which seems absurd. You know, I have a debt, I multiply by another debt, and no, I am out of debt. It would be nice if things were like this. So why is it that if you multiply two negative numbers, you get a positive one? Well, that's a coherence constraint. You can show through the laws of arithmetic that it must be like this if arithmetic is not to contradict itself from within, not to undermine itself. And this principle of coherence, I think, is pretty strong. And that's what we are always doing, even though we are not cognizant of it. We are always applying this principle of coherence to our understanding of ourselves and the world. Mm-hmm.
You also draw on the work of the logician Kurt Gödel and his theorem, and how he has shown that it's impossible for a logical system to be both consistent and complete.
Correct. That proof was made for formal systems. Yeah. And we have to be cautious about extrapolating that to everything, to life, the universe, and everything. But there is a strong intuition that arises from that result that I think is legitimately applicable in general to our thinking about reality. And as you said, the idea there is that you cannot make every statement that's true about a system without contradicting yourself. You either do not make every statement that is true. In other words, you miss out on stuff that is really real, and you cannot say anything about it. Or you make false statements. And that's peculiar because, let's pretend for a moment that we could simply apply this to our understanding of the universe. This is a very complicated question, whether we can do this really or not. Is the universe a formal system? This is not a settled question, but let's pretend that we could apply this to the universe. That would mean that we would either never know everything there is to know about the universe, or that would be wrong about certain things we think we know about the universe. And that sort of undermines this positivist, affirmative view of the human capabilities that we've had since the early 20th century, that, human nature, human beings are going to just, find the answers to every question and solve every problem. Well, maybe we should be a little bit more modest.
Coming back to quantum physics, you suggests that one way of interpreting things like quantum entanglement and Bell's theorem and the EPR paradox is to suggest that realism breaks down. I understand another way to look at it is to say that locality breaks down rather than realism, meaning that everything is interconnected. And it seems one way or another that what if everything is interconnected, or if realism breaks down, you're in a situation where the fundamental intuitive division that every person normally makes between what's inside their subjective experience and what's outside and their sensory perceptions of the world, they seem like two different realities. People are sort of native dualists. But you're suggesting that really, the inside and the outside are all part of the same reality, and that's how these bizarre events occur. It's something welling up from the depths of the psyche and then manifesting itself somehow in external reality.
That I couldn't have put it better than you just did. You put it perfectly. There's a lot to comment on and to unpack on the introduction you made to this conclusion. Quantum entanglement, does it discard realism? Does it refute realism, or does it refute locality? It is still officially an open question. I think it refutes realism. And the reason is, the most straightforward reason is that we have it's a technical thing. There are some so-called inequalities in quantum mechanics. Tony Leggett's inequalities. They were published in a paper, I think, in 2003 in the Journal of the Foundations of Physics. And it shows that if you can prove that quantum mechanics violates certain types of inequalities, certain statistical properties of the experiments, if you can show that statistically the experiments violate certain properties, Leggett's inequalities, some of them, if that can be demonstrated, would specifically refute realism, independent of locality. So you sort of disentangle the two from one another. You zoom in on realism and you say, okay, I can prove or disprove realism I can disprove realism with this. And people did the experiment. There were two papers, 2007 and 2010, in which those exact realism-related inequalities it was demonstrated that based on those inequalities that realism is either not true, or we have to significantly change our idea of the concept of objectivity. What we construe to be something objective, we would have to revise what we mean by it. In other words, the only way to save realism is to redefine what it means, which is a sort of, it's a cheat. Yeah. Realism as we understand it, that the world has definite properties out there regardless of your observation, that seems to be refuted more than once. Some would say, yes, it's refuted for a large class of non-local theories. But there are some non-local theories that may still survive, and the most eminent is Bohm's theory, Bohm's pilot wave theory. And strictly speaking, that can still survive. We have not eliminated that. But that theory has a huge set of problems physicists could elaborate on it better than me, but there's a huge set of problems associated with that, especially when you're trying to push the theory towards quantum gravity. There are issues with Bohm's theory. So if that's the only surviving possibility for realism, I tend to think, I don't think realism is tenable anymore. Of course, it's a very difficult thing intuitively to choose between whether you get rid of realism, the world has definite states independent of your observation. It's very intuitive that it should have. Either you discard that or you discard locality, that things influence one another only when they are more or less close to one another, that an event in this galaxy will not instantaneously influence an event in the Andromeda galaxy, right? It's very difficult to discard that as well, because it's so intuitive that to influence something, you have to come close to it, to being within the range of influence given the speed of light constraints. But we have to discard one or the other, and I think evidence shows that we should discard realism. The problem is, and that's the theme of the book again, if you discard realism, you are done with the correspondence theory of truth, and you have to revise the ground of our view of reality, which is our very logical axioms. It's not only about revising the laws of physics anymore. It's about revising the deepest self-evident intuitions about we have regarding how to think about the laws of physics. It's much deeper. And I think we are, as a civilization, we are confronting a situation now where we are being forced to have to revise that very ground of our thinking, the very axioms of our logic, of our basic way of thinking. And this is very big news.
It would seem to me that the other possibility, the other alternative is equally true. Once we give up locality, that means that if I wiggle my finger here, it's affecting events in the most distant reaches of the universe. Even my thoughts could be affecting distant galaxies. That also requires a complete revision of our notions of logic.
Strictly speaking, not necessarily.
Okay.
You do not need to revise your axioms of logic for that. But okay, let me now I have to elaborate a little bit more on that. Okay, let's pretend that there is no experimental reasons to favor getting rid of realism as opposed to getting rid of locality. Let's suppose they are on equal footing, empirically, experimentally. From a careful analysis of quantum theory itself, it has been shown that quantum theory is essentially, how do I put this in? It has been shown that two observers can describe the same system in two different ways, and both are right. And what this shows is that according to quantum theory, the knowledge you have of the world is relative to you. Mm-hmm. It's relational. And this understanding, people call it an interpretation. I think it's the wrong word. It is not an interpretation of quantum theory. This is an analysis and an understanding of the implications of quantum theory. It's not making any ontological interpretation about what it means to reality. It's just looking at the theory as it is and deriving its necessary implications. Carlo Rovelli did this in, I believe, in 1994. Paper was ultimately published in 1996, and it has become known now as relational quantum mechanics, or RQM. I don't think it's an interpretation, as I mentioned to you. It's just a derivation of the implications of quantum theory. And the implication is, as far as the physical world is concerned, in other words, physical quantities, mass, charge, momentum, geometric relationships, position, so forth. As far as these physical quantities are concerned, the physical world is relational. It is something to you, and it's something else to another observer. There is no overarching physical world that is the same for all of us. Quantum theory seems to refute this, because different observers can describe the same sequence of events in different ways, and they are all both true. An analogy is to talk about motion. Motion is relative to the observer. If I am at a train station platform and a train is approaching, that train has a motion relative to me. But if I am sitting inside the train, that train has no motion relative to me. It's static relative to me as a passenger sitting inside the train. But as somebody standing on the platform, there is motion, right? So motion is relative. And what relational quantum mechanics would say is that all physical quantities are relational in the way motion is. They are all relational to the observer. Of course, this raises all kinds of philosophical qualms. If all physical quantities are relational, then what are the absolutes that ground these relationships? Now, whatever they are, they cannot be physical because all physical quantities are relational. But relationships between relationships immediately lead to infinite regress. So you have to have absolutes to ground these relationships, but these absolutes cannot be physical. You get into all kinds of issues. Carlo Rovelli acknowledged that there are many philosophical qualms that arise from relational quantum mechanics, but these seem to be direct implications of the theory, regardless of experimentation. Now, it's a complicated commentary, but what I want to come to is this. If the physical world is relational, locality is an empty concept. The very idea of locality or non-locality assumes that you and I are inhabiting the same physical world. And if Alice is somewhere there and makes a measurement, there is a non-local influence on what Bob, who is somewhere else making another measurement, observes. That's the very idea of non-locality, that Alice and Bob separate by huge distances, depending on how they measure their systems, the result of the other is influenced. But the assumption behind this is that Alice and Bob are inhabiting the same physical universe. Only then you can talk about non-locality. If Alice and Bob are inhabiting essentially different physical universes, because quantum mechanics say that the universe is relational to its observer, and Alice is one observer and Bob is another observer, then the very idea of non-locality now suddenly makes no sense. We are in different universes. Within my universe, it's always local because I am the center of it. Now, this does not need to lead to solipsism, the idea that my life is the only thing going on and everything else is a phantasm, so to say. No. There is a joint environment that Alice and Bob, you and I all inhabit, but this joint environment is not physical. It's not constituted of physical quantities like mass, charge, momentum, inertia. So it's something else. What is this something else? Well, clearly it's mentation. Thoughts are the only thing non-physical that we have direct empirical access to. So the idea is that, the universe that we share is not a physical universe. It's a universe of thoughts, of transpersonal thoughts. And that the physical universe arises from an interaction between me as an observer with thoughts and these thoughts at large, these thoughts out there within which I am immersed. And it's an interference pattern between my thoughts and the thoughts of the universe at large that lead to the patterns we call the physical universe. And therefore, they are relational always to their observers because they arise from an interference pattern between the observer and the universe where the observer is immersed. This solves all the issues. You don't need to talk about non-locality now. The original motivation for non-locality disappears. Realism disappears in a sense, because now, yes, there is an objective universe out there, but it's thoughts. It's not physical quantities. And the correspondence theory of truth still disappears because it assumes that there are physical quantities upon which to ground the validity of statements I make about reality. Can I ground it on thoughts? Theoretically, yes, but now it's relative. Mm-hmm. Now it's how I interact with the thoughts at large that lead to what I consider to be my physical experience, the experience on the screen of my perception. And now suddenly there are many more degrees of freedom. Now you're talking about an interference pattern. So I contribute to it as much as the universe at large contributes to it. And I may have consensus with you about what we are perceiving, perhaps because I am imposing on what I perceive the same constraints that you are imposing on what you perceive. Perhaps to some extent due to cultural agreement, cultural conventions, to some extent maybe because of genetic similarities between my cognitive apparatus and your cognitive apparatus, which we necessarily bring to bear when we are interacting with the universe at large. But whichever way you look upon it, there are more fundamental degrees of freedom available to experience, and it becomes much harder to dismiss the absurd now as fundamentally impossible. You could say it's anomalous, it doesn't comply to the consensus, it has dropped some of the cultural or genetic constraints that usually we impose in our interaction with this thought universe around us, but it may still at a fundamental level be true.
sounds as if when you say that we exist in a realm of thoughts, that you're sort of hinting at a Platonic world.
I understand why you are saying this. So out there would be just the idea of forms, the Platonic ideas, and the distorted world of physicality that we see is an interaction between those Platonic forms and what I bring to bear when I interact with it. And the resulting interference is what arises on the screen of my perception. Yeah. The reason I'm cautious is that, Plato brought a lot more to this. He talks about the ideal solids and all that baggage, and I don't want to bring all that with it by simply giving you a blank acknowledgement of what you said. So yes, but I would be very cautious about how much baggage we bring from Plato to this.
I am aware that the idea of a Platonic world would be rather inconsistent with the intuitionist logic of mathematics. I
don't know.
Well, in any case, what you really are drawing upon, rather than a Platonic world, you're really endeavoring, as I read your book, to emphasize Jung's notion of the collective unconscious.
I think there are many names that we can... many people have looked at the same idea and have given it different names and have described it, of course, based on their own background, their own personal history, their own idiosyncrasies, emphasis, predispositions, and so forth. Jung brought to bear a strong religious and psychological perspective to it when he called it the collective unconscious. I think the name is a misnomer. I think it's not unconscious according to modern definitions of consciousness, namely phenomenal consciousness. I think it's certainly phenomenally conscious, but it's not metacognitive. And a lot of people conflate consciousness with metaconsciousness, or what Bloch called phenomenal consciousness versus access consciousness. There's a lot of conflation between these two terms. So never mind, this was an aside. So Jung brought to bear this psychological and religious, profoundly religious perspective. Jung was a very religious man. I try to be more neutral, more objective about it. I would call it universal consciousness, which is a very descriptive name, a very descriptive term, label to give to it. I think it's minimally biased. But there are others that some people call it the Akasha. I have seen so many names. Do I like Jung's perspective? Yes, I like Jung's perspective a lot. So after I have made this disclaimer, I'll proceed to embrace Jung's perspective, because what it has going for it is a lot of empirical data. And empirical data in this case is necessarily psychological, because you're talking about the inner experience of a human being who reports this inner experience. So that's how you build your data set. And you don't have a microscope to look into the collective unconscious. Well, you may have. Maybe CERN is a microscope that is looking at aspects of the collective unconscious. But it doesn't have the qualities of experience necessarily, because it abstracts everything into physical quantities. So personal reports are richer, more nuanced. So I think surrounding us, this universe of thoughts at large, within which we are immersed as individual centers of consciousness, I think that is equivalent to what Jung called the collective unconscious. He talked of the psychoid archetype, which is, he basically laid explicitly a bridge between the collective unconscious and what we call matter, even inanimate matter. So his intuition was leading him in this direction, that the world of inanimate matter surrounding us is merely the extrinsic appearance of universal thoughts within which we are immersed. In other words, it's just the way these universal thoughts present themselves to us via our perceptual cognitive apparatus. I think Jung was hinting at this. He was coming very close to this. He may not have said this quite explicitly, but he came very close to this, motivated by a wealth of empirical data based on the report of his thousands of patients. And I find that extraordinarily interesting.
And in particular, his relationship with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli led him to, both he and Pauli, to develop ideas of the relationship between mind and matter.
Yes, I think that once you contemplate this possibility that the world that we share is not made of definite physical quantities, but it's made of a superposition of thoughts, and that the physical world we perceive is actually arising from an interaction between our own inner thoughts and the thoughts at large, that we are co-participants in the creation of reality in this constructivist manner. Once you accept this, at least as a hypothesis, many other possibilities now become conceivable. One of them is that the events and entities of the world are not only connected causally with one another, in other words, through a network of cause and effect that we have been able to model by physics, but maybe because they're essentially mental. Behind the physical world, there is essentially thoughts in superposition. Because of this mental nature, maybe the events that we see are also connected through meaning, because meaning is a mental property. It's not a physical property. There is no meaning in a purely physical world by definition. But in mentality, there is meaning, which operates through cognitive associations. If the world around us is essentially mental, then things may be connected through a network of meaning, in addition to being connected through a network of cause and effect relationships. And that's the basis of Jung's and Pauli's idea of synchronicity, that events can occur together because they are connected by meaning and significance, not only because they are connected causally.
And you point out that many of the bizarre events that we started to talk about, UFO sightings and religious miracles of various sorts, they read like dreams in a way. They're laden with dreamlike symbolism.
Yes. I think we ordinarily operate under a set of constraints that are imposed by genetics, our cognitive apparatus, that are imposed by cultural narratives that we buy into unreservedly, and that we internalize so much that it sort of filters out what we acknowledge to be perceiving of the world around us. But I think that there are fluctuations in these sets of constraints caused by a number of factors, drugs or psychological predispositions, trauma, whatever, and or innocence, which is a big one. And when you have these fluctuations, suddenly you perceive more than you normally allow yourself to perceive. And the connections you then see can very well be connections of meaning, can be synchronicities. The world may reflect your inner state. The world may reflect how you feel within, the questions you ask yourself, the things you crave, the meaning you look for. The world your experience suddenly may provide symbols that address those inner questions, that address those inner needs, so to say. And they are indistinguishable from normal reality, from normal physical reality, which is completely understandable because there is no fundamental difference in essence between the two. It's a matter of how you are interacting with the thoughts at large and what degrees of freedom do you allow for in that interaction. And so, yeah, that's a possibility. And I think that accounts for the similarity between Joel Simonton's UFO experiences on the one hand, fairy lore, dreams, psychedelic trances, and all of this wide gamut we have of experiences of absurdity, of high strangeness, as they call. I, for one, if we talk about UFOs, I tend to lend more credence to high strangeness experiences than to experiences or reports of experience that seem to fit very neatly with this idea that UFOs are just, metal spaceships from another solar system. Because, the latter seems to be so compliant with the mainstream hypothesis, or with what would fit with the mainstream cultural narrative about what is allowed to be or not to be, that you kind of suspect that this may be manufactured. Yeah. But when somebody has the guts to report an experience that is absurd, that violates the axioms of Aristotelian logic, then to me it's like, well, this person has guts. There's sincerity involved in here. And when you look deeper into it, clearly there is meaning in it. Mm-hmm. Not literal meaning, but meaning in a synchronistic way. And there is a network of meaning expressing itself through those experiences that are indistinguishable from ordinary physical experiences.
Well, you also seem to be very open to the idea that events that seem so absurd as to be logically impossible actually do occur, that people are not lying or are not hallucinating when they report these events.
Correct. And then the question is, what do we mean by to say that they do occur? Do they occur as experiences? I think that's practically certain. These people experience this. Yeah. Then the next question is, well, what is the status, the ontological status of that experience? What can we make of it? And I think there we should apply the criteria of consensus. Yes, it's true as an experience, but the ordinary world is true as an experience as well. There is no actual definite physical reality underlying that world, because I think realism has been refuted experimentally. So now you're on equal footing. You can't get away with this by just saying, well, it's just his experience. Yes, but this is also just our experience. It's just that we happen to have consensus, and in some cases there is no consensus. And in some other cases there is partial consensus, like the miracle of the sun at Fatima in Portugal in 1917. There's an experience shared by thousands of people which violate not only physics, but logic as well. It was an absurd experience, an experience of high strangeness. But those thousands of people who were there did have consensus about what they, at least some degree of consensus about what they witnessed. Mm-hmm. It's just like there was a local fluctuation in the degrees of freedom of reality that applied in that specific moment, that specific position in space-time. Yeah. So it's a relative thing, and the relative character here is the degree of consensus. It's an experience that is absurd is not necessarily fundamentally different from ordinary experience, as it would be under materialism. Mm-hmm. Under materialism, our consensus reality is modulated by an objective world out there with definite physical properties that stimulates our sense organs and leads to the experience of the ordinary world. But a private experience would be a hallucination that's not modulated by signals impinging on our sense organs. So under materialism, there would be this fundamental difference in the origin of the experience. One would originate in something that's not mind and is just stimulating mind through impingement on the sense organs, and the other one would be entirely endogenous, entirely generated within one's own psyche, unrelated to the sense organs, and it would have a completely different nature. What I'm saying is that I think we have good reasons to think that there is no such fundamental distinction. The only distinction there is a relative one, is one of consensus, because fundamentally both experiences arise through an interaction between our own thoughts and the thoughts at large, and what we bring to bear on that interaction.
The problem that I have with that interpretation, I guess it comes down to politics, because where I live in this country right now, you have political division, where you have one group of people who seem to be generating consensus around a set of facts that they accept, and another group of people who are basically saying your facts are wrong.
So that's a very good point. Thanks for bringing this up, because I want to make it very clear. I am not a believer in, quote, alternative facts. I don't think there are such things as arbitrary alternative facts that one can just make up. I think there is a reality that we inhabit, and which is not dependent on our surface belief systems, on our opinions, on our political positions. There are such things as facts. What I'm saying is that the essential nature of what we call facts is such that a hallucination and a fact, which are two different things as far as you, from an epistemic point of view, as far as you make of that experience, these are different things. But in terms of their origin, how they arise through the machinery of nature, they are the same. They are both mental phenomena. And the distinction is that one belongs to a network of coherency constraints that leads to consensus, and the other one is idiosyncratic. But now when you talk about a society and politics, what is it that matters? Is it the idiosyncrasies of your visions, or is it that reality that is given by the solid, evolved network of consensus and coherency constraints that govern our lives within a society? Well, of course, it is the latter. And this latter thing, although it's not fundamental in the sense that it's a world outside mind, no, it's a construct within mind, but it is not nothing. It is something. It is a network of coherence constraints. It exists, it plays a role, and the origin of facts resides in it. And this thing is much beyond you as an individual inhabitant of that network of coherence constraints. You're an inhabitant it. Maybe you're contributing a little bit to it, but it's much bigger than you, and it has a reality independent of you as an individual human being. You're inserted within that. And within that, there are, quote, objective facts. In other words, facts that are such whether you want them to be such or not. Whether you like them or not, they still hold within this network of coherence constraints. And as such, they are still facts.
We could talk a long time about American politics, so I'm not going to pursue it any further this time, Bernardo. Perhaps in the future we could really take a closer look at that. But I do think we've covered your work on finding meaning in absurdity. So I want to thank you very much for this discussion. It's been a pleasure, and it's been very enlightening.
It's been a lot of fun for me as well. Again, Jeff, I'm getting used to this, so you have to invite me again, I'm afraid.
No, I'd be very happy to. I know that you have a number of other books we haven't gotten to yet, and you've been revising them all and trying to keep your thinking current on many different dimensions. So I do look forward to our next conversation.
I do too. Thanks very much.
Thank you.